Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Crime Grace Kokon. Let's get into the video. In today's video, I know you guys wanted to see the alternative history videos. They are coming soon, I promise. But I forgot actually there's one final thing that we had to do with regard to the political theory series. And then also, when I first set up the channel, I'd written a script for a video on IQ. So that's going to be the video after this one, so expect that to come out on Sunday. But for this video today, we're going to be looking at individualism. We're going to look at its history, look at its great thinkers, and also some of the influence that it's had on the world. So no doubt, many of you would have heard the expression, no man is an island. The idea being that we need each other, right? We're social beings. So to the extent that human beings can exist by themselves, it's been a thing where in evolutionary terms, it's never been that ever. And so this concept of individualism, is actually a lot more recent than one might think. So when we think about early humans, when we first started out, we started out in communities of about 30 to about 50. These people were, one way one could think of it is your family, your close friends, your extended family, etc. And this was kind of the general kind of communities that we used to live in. And even to today, like if you think about how many people you genuinely know on like a deeper level, it's roughly around that. Maybe for some people it's less, but it's unlikely to be more than that. Like kind of, you might have like 1,000 friends on Instagram, etc. But in reality, how intricately do you know their lives and vice versa? In that regard, people we've always been social in that sense. But there's one thing for like survival, right? If we imagine like someone living on a desert island, and we think about the cost of doing such thing, right? We do understand that obviously there is a requirement to work together. It's that old thing that that the economist Milton Friedman used to say about no one in the whole world knows how to make a pencil, right? And this is the story of the pencil. In order to make even one pencil, you need someone who like is going to cut down the wood, and then where you're going to get the saw from, you're going to need to get metal from like the ground. Then you're going to need to it's a long process, and then you need to get rubber, and then you need to get like etc. Like so, and then you need to dig out graphite and ship, so. No one person knows how to make a pencil. So in that regard, human beings need to work together. But the question with regard to individualism is not to say that we don't need people at all, because it's true, no man is an island. No one came here by themselves. No one was educated fully by themselves. No one was fed, etc., fully by themselves. Like there is no such thing as the fully independent like person living by themselves, right? And like from start to finish throughout the course of their lives. And so in that regard, it's a thing where people do need each other, but it's a question of what value does the individual have in relation to the collective? The collective has its uses, but if the individual and the rights that are inherent within the individual are put to one side, then it's a thing of, can human society really elevate itself beyond this kind of basic survival stage? How can we get past that stage into a thing where we're reaching self-actualization as such, as a species? That's some of the things we're going to look into in this video. So up until 1820, people did not refer to human beings as individuals. The only time that people used the term individual was if they were talking about things like horses. This idea of the individual with relation to human beings is itself an incredibly modern concept. The term was first coined by two Frenchmen, Joseph de Maistre, Claude Henri Saint-Simon, and also a third one, Félicité Robert de Lemanis. Yeah, see, my pronunciation of French is still terrible. They used individualism in a critical sense. So when we think about different societies, we have to think that different societies have different core values. Well, society itself doesn't have values. The people within those societies have values, right? Because people make society. What one tends to find is that a lot of the thinkers that came from France, because of the legacy of of French history as such, being relatively more autocratic than you would see across the channel, it is a thing where individualism was first coined as a critique. It was basically equating it with anarchy. It was basically saying that if we if we delineate ourselves like from this collective, if we kind of segment ourselves into tiny little like atomized particles and stuff, right? Then it's a thing where actually the entire species breaks down, stuff. The entire social structure breaks down, because if everyone's just interested just in themselves, then it means that actually like there's no cohesion in society, there's no direction, there's no kind of order. And so the theory was that actually if you had individualism, the entire society would break down. It wasn't actually until you had the word itself reach more Protestant countries. Now, what I mean by this is this: when we think about medieval Christendom was centered in Rome, and the Pope said what was what. With regard to the Reformation, you started to have a real opening up of people being like, actually, it's for us as individuals to interpret the word of God. Where did this kind of idea even come from? The concept of like man being created in God's image, and therefore having the autonomy to interpret scripture in one's own way. That, you know, is a very revolutionary kind of thing, right? We tended to find these in Protestant nations because you already had this Reformation, you already had this explosion of people with different ideas, different interpretations of how to interpret like kind of Christian doctrine. What we find is that as opposed to France, to places like Germany, places like Britain, places like America, individualism takes on a very different meaning and a lot more positive meaning. So in Germany, it takes on a romantic take because it's tied in with German romanticism. The intrinsic kind of like value of the individual kind of like, well, particularly the individual German. In Britain, and also like, and even more so in America, the term individualism becomes really tied in with kind of economic like and social freedom. Yeah, so it's the right of the individual to do what he or she wishes. Yeah, so long as it doesn't harm someone else. And this concept of I'm gonna be able to set up my own business. Yeah, I'm gonna run it my way. I'm gonna pay people what like kind of what, etc. All this kind of stuff, right? It rewards people for taking private initiative, yeah? So they're not waiting about for government bureaucrats to say what can and cannot be done. It's a thing of, through their own like intuition, for their own ingenuity, for their own creativity, they are going to take the initiative, and they are the ones who are going to take the risk, and they might fail, but they also might succeed. And it's the freedom of the individual to take those risks, which we're going to look into here. But of course, this channel doesn't just look at the definitions, we're going to look at some of the deeper history of this. So before looking west, we have to first look east. And what we have to look into is the fact that actually the idea of the individual having intrinsic worth first arose from India with the religion of Buddhism, and also later with Jainism. Within these religions, we have the concept of karma, which many of us like kind of are well aware of. The idea of karma being that if I as an individual wrong you, then bad things will happen to me. And if I'm good to you, then good things will happen to me. As opposed to all the other religions that have been about at that time. The idea in those before that had been that actually what mattered was the group. Yeah, what mattered was the collective. So there would be collective punishment, there'd be collective things, right? And the way to kind of do things would be through ritual, it'd be through like praying to the gods, etc. But there was no intrinsic value on being a good person as such, and you can see this with many of the kind of stories that we find like kind of across the world. It's not necessarily the righteous person who's held up. It's often the most cunning, the strongest, like kind of like you know, the most violent person, you know, would be held in high esteem. Karma flips on its head and makes you kind of think, actually, for me to please the gods or God, I need to do something which is actually good in the world. This shifts the dynamic. It puts the onus onto the individual and says, actually, you are responsible for your life. Yeah, you're responsible for whether you lead a good life or a bad life, right? And there's certain parameters which lead a good life and bad life. And we can think of this most simply in the concept of the golden rule, right? Treat others as you want to be treated yourself. And again, we see these teachings in the Christian church, like many centuries after it arose in Buddhism. Out in Asia, started in India, as these kind of ideas kind of spread to China, you also had Confucianism, which again spoke about that kind of, we discussed this in our previous video on philosophy, right? And why you should care. Definitely check that video out. Looking at Confucius, and his orderly society. People often misunderstand Confucianism in terms of it being very top down, and it's because it speaks about hierarchies. In reality, it focuses a lot more on the microcosm, like kind of each individual person, yeah, and their place within society, and the certain things that they as individuals have to do in order to keep the society going. So it's not just this is what everyone has, this is just the orders, yeah, and I'm the person at the top of them. It's a whole system whereby every single person has a part to play in the system, and each person is responsible for themselves in how they conduct themselves within that. And we also see this in Taoism, which is another Chinese philosophy which we mentioned in that video. The famous Taoist from the 4th century, Chuang Tzu, probably butchered the pronunciation of that, but he said that the only way for us to actually achieve inner peace and freedom is actually through how we conduct ourselves within the society, right? That if we put violence out into the world, then we're going to have violence come back to us. And so the only way that we can actually be content with ourselves is by ourselves taking responsibilities for our actions. Now, moving back west, we have to think of the ancient Greek philosopher Socrates. For those who don't know the teaching of Socrates, we touched on him in that philosophy video as well. But what was not mentioned in that video was about how he came to meet his end. Socrates was charged with corrupting the youth of Athens and for blasphemy. There was a big trial in which, well, first of all, he had the option of fleeing, right? And he refused. And they said, right, this is a trial, you're going to be put to death. And he's like, okay. And they said, okay, right, so you're going to defend yourself, right? And he's like, nope. And he said, I'm not even gonna kind of basically dignify this with any kind of thing. So he, if anything, he antagonized his jurors, right? So it was picked by lot, and from memory, there was, I believe, hundreds of people who took part in this, and they had to vote on whether he would live or whether he'd be sentenced to death. As the trial went on, he infuriated people more, and purposely got it so that a majority of people in the end voted for him to face the death penalty. And as a result, he ended up having to drink poison, and he committed suicide. One of the things that he said was know yourself. So more importantly than trying to work out the bigger things in society, try and work out yourself. Try and work out what it is that it means to be you. He ended up being kind of one of the first kind of martyrs in a way that one could think of with regard to individualism, because for him, society wanted him to do a certain thing. With regard to him being an individual, he wanted to go against the grain of society. This is what it really means to be an individual, to be the person who stands alone and who says, no, I want to do this, even if the rest of society says for me to do something else. And we also had another Greek philosopher called Democritus, right? And he said, he was the first person who came up with the concept of an atom, right? And said that atoms make up all things within matter, within nature, within humans. This idea also of individual human beings, the kind of being atomized, had rights within their own selves. They were part of a collective, but they weren't solely part of a collective. The collective was made up of them rather than them being made up of the collective. And there's also the famous Greek sophist, known as Protagoras of Abdera, right? And so I butchered the pronunciation of his name. And there's also the famous Greek sophist, known as Protagoras of Abdera. And he famously said that man is the measure. So the individual men, or as we now later I've come to believe, women as well, of course. The idea being that the individual is what we measure society by, not by society as a whole, but it's a society made up of individuals. Now, moving forward a few hundred years, when we get to the time of the early Christian church, right, we start to understand that there's a bit of a split now between Christianity and Judaism. When reading the Old Testament, we see that time and time again there's references to God's covenant with his people. This concept of God having a covenant with the people rather than with individuals. Yes, there were individual prophets, but the individual Hebrews, the individual Jews, unless they happen to be a prophet, they're not the ones who are kind of engaging directly with God. The whole concept is very much about we are a community, we are the Jewish people, we are together and we're working together, etc., right? And this is this is part of the reason why Jews have had such a level of strength throughout like thousands of years of persecution, because they've stuck together, because this is what like their religion like says. So all the other ancient people of those times, they believed in other things which withered on the vine and stuff, right? So Jews were able to stick together because of this idea of this divine covenant that encapsulates all the Jewish people. Christianity, a little bit different from that. So the teachings of Jesus was very much turn the other cheek. It was very much thinking about you and your individual relationship with God and your individual salvation with God. And as a result of that, it meant that Christianity created like a level of like self-worth for people, that no matter what they've done throughout their lives, that it was on them to repent, it was on them to atone for their sins and stuff, right? And that it wasn't about us as a group coming together and collectively atoning stuff. It was about us as individuals taking responsibility for our own life and for our own sins. Move forward to roughly about 400 AD. We have Saint Augustine of Hippo. What he really pushed for was the idea that actually it was for us as human beings to decide whether we wanted to commit acts of good or commit acts of evil. That there was no external force making us be good or making us be bad, and that it wouldn't be desirable to have if God. People often make the argument with regard to like kind of, if God is real, then why do people do bad things more? It's like, the point is that you wouldn't want there to be a world in which God made everyone be good and stuff, right? Because human beings need to have free will, they need to have free agency. This idea of free will is itself, it was a very like new concept at that time, right? Like relatively speaking, and the idea that actually it was on you to decide: do you want to take the path of what's righteous, or do you want to take the path that is unrighteous? Christianity really was a bit of a game changer, especially with regard to how the European world kind of like viewed things. Because in the time of like ancient Greece and ancient Rome, yes, you had inklings of this in Greek philosophy, but the gods of ancient Rome and ancient Greece were not necessarily moral, like kind of, if we look at the stories of the pantheon of gods and stuff, there's no clear kind of moral, this is what you should do to be a good person, right? It's kind of like you need to please the gods, and the gods, the human beings are playthings of the gods, right? And this is a very dehumanizing view in a way, because it kind of goes like, well, okay, like there's no agency, there's nothing for me to like of how I should live a good life. And this is what some of the philosophers such as Socrates tried to actually like tackle, that like actually the God, like within our religion, is not saying anything about how to be a good person, to what does it actually mean to be a good person, whereas Christianity deals with deals with these issues. So after the rise of Christianity, the next Abrahamic religion that rose up was obviously Islam. So how does Islam differ with Christianity? Well, like the word Islam means to submit to the will of Allah, right? So one might like take that as a thing of actually the individual is being subordinated, but actually it's far from that. To say that one submits to it is more a thing of you as an individual. For you to live a good life, you have to listen to what Allah has laid down in the Quran. Although Islam tends to focus on more ritual, like kind of like carnal things, in terms of don't eat this, because this will make you impure. Don't do this, etc. Whereas what Jesus said is nothing outside the body can make it impure. Only something within the body can make the body impure, right? So different ideas of this, but still the same overarching principle, which is that actually it's for you, like you're responsible, like kind of like for how, like on the day of judgment, you're responsible for what you've done in your life. You're going to be held accountable. It's not going to be your tribe, it's not going to be like the nation, etc., etc. It's you as an individual are going to be held accountable. So if you're being a good person, then you'll be rewarded in heaven. If not, then you're going to go to the other place. This is how like some of the major religions in the world really like start to take a hold, and actually like it's quite an appealing sense, especially for many people in that society. So if you were part of the elites in those societies, and you had the Roman gods, you had like it didn't really matter so much. Like you were kind of in charge of stuff, yeah, and you didn't have to really question like whether you had any worth and stuff. But if you're a slave in ancient Rome, or you're just a poor person anywhere, like kind of in any of this time, all of a sudden you have these religions such as the Christianity and later Islam, which says that actually, even though you're a slave, you're still created in the image of God. You still have intrinsic worth. You still have intrinsic like value. When we ask like where does individualism come from, the actual foundations of it actually are very much influenced within the ancient religions. So not to say that everyone who believes in individualism like kind of is religious. That's like not necessarily the case at all. But the point being that a lot of the philosophical underpinnings for this individualism are highly tightly interwoven with the story of of these organized religions and the mass appeal that these religions had. Now, as we mentioned, the Protestant Reformation also had a massive impact on this, because all of a sudden you went through a period where what the Pope says was literally gospel to a thing of actually it's competing interpretations, and all the religious wars, all the conflicts and stuff that arose in Europe like during those centuries made people have to really actually think about actually what sort of society do you want to live in, where large segments of our population follow the faith in a different way than what we do. Martin Luther by launching the Protestant Reformation inadvertently and unintentionally actually spurred a lot of the arguments for this idea of individualism. And actually, again, in a lot of Germanic societies where people worship Protestantism, it was a thing of actually this is where you start to see the concept and actually quite an argument for democracy, because people start saying what touches all must be decided by all, right? This concept of politics impacts all of us, right? And so therefore it's on all of us to take a part in it, and we all have a right to take a part in this. Rather than just being this elite group of people, we all have a say in how we are governed. And during this time as well, when you having to find a level of tolerance, for people with different views, led to a lot of people led to a great liberalization of concepts with regard to what it meant to be a heretic. So the Frenchman Sebastian Castillon, he made the argument, which was entitled in his work, was written in Latin, so I'm going to have to try and read the Latin. De heretics an sint persequende. So on heretics, whether they are to be persecuted, right? And so this was, within the Catholic Church asking, right, is it right to persecute heretics? And the argument that Castillon was making was that actually, if faith was not genuine, there was no point in having a Spanish Inquisition. There's no point in torturing people and exiling them and threatening them with being killed and stuff, right? Because at the end of the day, people had to come to this by themselves, and even if they were rebelling against the established church, it still meant that actually they had a right to do so, and to try and force them to think otherwise was insincere. And there's no point in having a bunch of insincere converts here that you're not going to really trust anyway, and they're going to be very begrudging, and they're not actually going to really follow the new faith anyway. So then you had the Dutch thinker Spinoza, and he makes the argument, he's the first one to make the argument that actually, because of this issue with regard to the consciousness of the people and stuff, right, and the rights of the individual to think differently, it said that actually you can't have a government then which says this is an established religion, because if people do not adhere to that, well, they still live within the state, so you're basically telling people that they have to think this certain way, right? And that just means that you're going to live in a totalitarian society, where the government is working with the church to enforce this thing of actually, no, you don't have a right to think differently. And then the whole concept of freedom the whole concept of freedom of speech, the whole concept of freedom of belief, freedom of faith. This is, again, without these arguments here, which again are very religiously based, there isn't much of an argument with regard to individualism, because without that underpinning, without that kind of intellectual and philosophical like thought process that got us to that point, there wouldn't you wouldn't have had a reason to have necessarily allowed people to have their different opinions on things, because people in those days didn't tend to like debate about what the tax rate should be. So politics in those days as such was about what religion are we following and stuff, right? So religion played a much bigger part than party politics did. And we also had another Frenchman called Pierre Bayle, I believe. I don't know how to pronounce French names. That's my thing on this channel, right? But he argued, even for quite a revolutionary thing, that even the persecution of atheists, yeah, should not be condoned, because again, people have a right to believe in God or not to believe in God. And so like to try and compel people to believe, yeah, whether one thinks that is morally right, or like kind of, you know, whether it's a sin, whatever, it's a thing of actually it's not for other people to impose that on it. So if someone has lost faith in God, it's not for someone else to impose that faith back in them. If there is a day of judgment, yeah, like kind of, then it's a thing of, well, they're going to have to explain that to God themselves, but it's not for an outside person, not for a third person to be the judge of that. Again, so we're starting to get more and more into the kind of like pre-Enlightenment period, and you know, you start to see people like John Locke, like from England, making the argument that actually churches should be voluntary associations, right? They shouldn't be, you shouldn't be compelled to have to go to church, you don't have to belong to a church, etc., etc. It should be completely voluntary, nothing to do with the government, and that's the only way that you're going to have a genuine free society, where people are actually able to go, oh, I want to go to that church, oh, I don't want to go to church, oh, I kind of, I want to, you know, I'm like, so it's only in that kind of context, because people in those days were far, far more religious than we are today. And so for them, everything had to be like wrapped within this concept of debating about religion. And it's through Locke that we first get the concept of freedom of religion being actually enshrined in a kind of like binding kind of like document, yeah, right? So the English Constitution, kind of 1689, was heavily influenced by the work of John Locke. And in his second treatise of government, this is where he first comes up with the term of life, liberty, and property, right? And talking about people's God-given, like God, you know, their inalienable right to have access to these things, yeah, like they had a God-given right to life, a God-given right to liberty, a God-given right to property, right? And so no one outside of like a legal process, yeah, can deny you of any of those things without due process of the law. So this is really kind of the underpinning of the kind of what comes later with the Enlightenment period. And again, it's through having this freedom of consciousness, because with freedom of consciousness, that leads to freedom of religion, and freedom of religion, a lot of the churches tried to censor certain books, they tried to ban things, they tried to stop people from reading certain things. And he argued in that second treatise also that the government should not censor things, churches should not censor things, because by them censoring things, they are stopping people from freely being able to choose what it is that they believe in. So it's better to allow people to read what it is that they want and for them to make up their own decisions, rather than having a church official or government official coming around and saying, this is what you have to believe and you can't believe in that. So before we get into the Enlightenment part of this video, what we have to do first of all is like, comment, subscribe, watch more videos, and also don't forget to share, spread the love, yeah? It took me a lot of time putting these videos together. For people who have been on the channel for a while, they'll know many of my quirks, and they'll know like kind of, you know, that like it's been appreciated, the kind of work that I have put into it. And even when people have disagreed with me, they've been very respectful, and I'll give lots of praise to that. Some of the comments obviously have been a bit leave it, and some of them I've been a bit confused by, whatever, but either way, anything is love, because, you know, I'd much rather people criticize what I have to say in the comment section, because then I know what I can improve on, what people like kind of like and what they don't like, etc., etc. So really let your views be known in the comment section. And yeah, definitely, like, everyone must know friends, family, someone, work colleague who'd be interested in watching these videos here. So please don't forget to really share this around with people. Yeah, that's enough of my plug now. So now we're going to start talking about the Enlightenment period. And this was a time at which, what we start to think of as kind of liberal, like modern liberal kind of like thought really coming together as succinct ideas, right? And, in the same year of the Declaration of Independence for America, that's when Adam Smith, the famous economist from Scotland, wrote his book, The Wealth of Nations. In another book he wrote, called Moral Sentiments, he outlines very clearly this idea of this invisible hand of the market. So the idea behind this is this: Adam Smith, he's the person who came up with the idea of the division of labour. He's the person who, he's the first kind of really like classical liberal, like kind of like economist that we can kind of think of, right? And many of the things that he was arguing for is that actually the greater good is done when individuals are able to pursue their own self-interest. Yeah, so the candlestick maker, the baker, the butcher, etc. I think I've got that in the wrong order, whatever. These people are not going out for the good of their community necessarily. Yeah, people don't set up businesses to be like, oh, well, I want to help my community. Maybe some people do, right? But by and large, it's for their own self-profit, right? People do things for profit. The society is benefited by the entrepreneurs, by the business people who have these things, because that's where we get our products from. This is where we get new innovations from. This is where we get the supplies of our bare necessities from as well. By people pursuing their own self-interest, like having the thing of, I want to be rich, it means that, or I want to at least very least be well off. It means that people go, actually, right, like, we now have more options because people are now incentivized to set up their own shops, which means that there's competition, which means that we, the consumers, all benefit. So the whole society benefits from people as individuals pursuing their own individual things. And the same thing works with employment as well. You are looking for a job. You working in that job is benefiting people because you're providing a service for people that's valued, and so you're getting paid. You go to that job, you might enjoy it, you might not enjoy it, but either way, you're getting something in reward for that, right? You're getting wages, right? But if everyone was like, no, I don't want to do that, right? Then it'd be, people, if we had a society where people didn't have to work for wages, how many jobs would necessarily be done? Not to say that no one would go to work at all, but a large segment of the population, probably the majority, would be like, actually, why am I going to do this if there's no reward for me, right? And you can say, oh, for the good of the community, and there'll be some people who are so altruistic that they would like continue working for the good of their wider community, but the vast majority of people would not do that. So people pursuing their own individual interests, that's what furthers society. And this then later ties in with what Jeremy Bentham was saying, which is this idea of utilitarianism, which is that actually what we want to do is create a society which benefits the most, for the people as a whole, right? Which, it serves people's individual interests as much as possible. So the greatest good that can possibly be done is what ought to be done. So if something only serves the interest of like a tiny group of people, then it's not good, right? You want to have the policy which, broadly speaking, will benefit the most people, the vast majority of people. But with this idea of individualism, you get two different competing opponents to it, yeah? One being the more socially conservative types, right? So people like Edmund Burke, who criticised individualism by saying it would lead to hedonism, it would lead to people like just engaging in their own base interests, yeah, whether that be drugs, whether that be sex, whether that be whatever, right? And so they would not actually, the whole society would completely disintegrate if you allowed this to kind of run amok, right? And that actually what you needed was a bit more of an orderly society, and so this is where the constant debate between liberalism and conservatism comes into it, in terms of, and this is something we discussed in previous videos, so definitely check those out. So there's the socially conservative argument with regard to it in terms of having things atomized breaks down social order and leads to chaos. The other argument against individualism tends to come more from what we describe as the political left, right? So this idea that actually you didn't start your own business, you didn't start like you needed government roads, you needed government schools, government this, right? So people all coming together as a society, right? So through the state, that's how the society. So if we think about it in these terms, right? I believe that one of the biggest debates, which at the core of like kind of our Western understanding of liberal democracies is this, right? What is at the center of society? Is it the state and the collective, or is it the individual? So if the society is centered around the state, then then everything must be orientated in that way. If everything is centered around the collective and what serves the collective interest, then it will lead to a certain set of policies, yeah? If, however, the society believes that the individual is sovereign and that the individual is the foundational blocks within the society, and that everything else must emanate from that, yeah? So it starts with the individual, then the family, then the community, then the nation, right? So having this bottom-up approach rather than a top-down approach, right? This is part of the big debate about how should we actually govern ourselves? How should we run our societies? Should individualism be held up to a higher thing, or should it not be? And you can see this now with the debate with regard to how best to tackle the current kind of pandemic that we're all going through, right? A collectivist approach would say, actually, we all have to work together as a society, we have to put money in our NHS, we have to do this, we have to do that, raise taxes, etc., and we have to worry about what everyone else is doing, we have to fine people if they don't wear masks, we have to fine people if they do this, and everything's focused on what everyone else in society is doing. Whereas an individualist approach would be, actually, I as an individual have certain health risks. I'm going to do to minimize that is I'm going to wear a mask, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it. So by us taking care of ourselves, right, as individuals, if everyone did that for our society, so the argument goes, then we would actually end up with a much better result, which would have far less negative externalities, i.e. bad, unforeseen kind of effects, right, like side effects. So having a top-down approach ends up oftentimes being very inefficient, very clumsy, ends up leading to a lot of problems that we didn't foresee, and that actually sometimes having a more individualist approach can better deal with these bigger problems, because individualism says that it all starts with the individual, right? Like, we can't try and fix the world if we're not taking care of ourselves. It's as Jesus said, so take the splint out of your own eye before taking it out of your brother's, right? The idea that actually you need to worry about what you're doing before trying to help others, before worrying about how society should be run. Maybe worry about how your own life should be run and what you can do to improve it. Because if everyone had that attitude of how can I improve my life insofar as it doesn't hurt other people, then we'd all live in a much better world, right? And as we start getting further and further, towards the present day, we start to have philosophers such as Nietzsche, right, who really criticize collectivism and criticized this kind of, because he basically said that it was basically us all going through like a herd mentality, right? That we're all basically like cattle, and we all kind of, if you have collectivism, that everyone must follow a certain path, right? And no one actually stops and thinks as an individual of what the best course is to take. And and as this ends up going into the 20th century, we start to have thinkers who are of the more like libertarian right persuasion, such as Rand, who she really big advocate for individualism, and said that man must a famous thing that she said. There were many famous things she said. She said, the question is not what is the meaning of life. The question is, what is the meaning of your life, right? And having this idea that you are responsible, that you have to take care of your own life, and that like by she even went a step further. She said that actually altruism, caring about others, yeah, and putting the needs of others above yourself is actually a moral evil. This is the argument that she made, which, you know, like kind of like it's quite like it's quite an opposite thing to like oh, the whole of society like should be governed centrally and collectively, yeah, versus actually no, like we shouldn't even be worrying about other people, yeah, we need to focus on ourselves because it's immoral if we you know. So two different sides of the spectrum of that. Like people obviously make up their own decision on where they lie somewhere within that spectrum, right? But it's a thing of what Ayn Rand was trying to say and what many other libertarian thinkers were trying to say, and this is again why you need to check out the video History on Libertarianism as well as many other videos that cover these topics, is you see this idea that actually if the individual focuses on themselves, then the whole wider society is helped. And this ties up with like a famous quote by Margaret Thatcher, which obviously which often ends up getting like misquoted or like, you know. So she said there's no such thing as society, and normally that people go stop the presses, yeah, like that's the quote on itself. But what she went on to say was this: there's no such thing as society, there are only individuals and families, right? So that's a little bit different when you have the whole quote. It's basically saying that actually society doesn't exist. Society is this kind of this idea that's out there, right? But actually what society is individuals and families coming together and working together building a community and working together, and this is how we actually build a nation. This is what the nation is, and this is how we govern ourselves. It's from the bottom up. It's grassroots, right? So this is, you know, these are the arguments being made, typically on the right, but whether it's left or right, I think that this is quite it's a very strongly libertarian stance. The authoritarian stance is this collectivism, is this top-down approach, but the libertarian approach is this idea of the bottom up. And so with that said, hope you found that video very interesting. And yeah, please, like I said, like, share, comment, watch loads more of my videos. There's plenty of them already out there. There's plenty more like kind of like there's plenty more to come. Like I said, Sunday we're going to be doing a video on IQ, and then from next week, that's when we're going to start kicking into the alternative history videos, right? Such as what would happen if Churchill won in the 1945 election, what if JFK lost the 1960 election, what if this happened, what if that happened, etc., etc. We've got a whole bunch of things out, right? So if you're a nerd like me and you really are into these like alternative history and stuff, and it's not going to be some wacky stuff, so don't start thinking, oh, I'm going to switch off or whatever. There is a whole ton of history tied in within that, and everything I'm going to say is based on what I think, like, logically speaking, makes sense. Yeah, I'm not going to predict too far into the future. I'm not going to like start overly theorizing. I'm going to say, based on the information we have, this is probably the trend that we can expect to see. Okay, so yeah, so with that being said, I hope that you really enjoyed this video, and yeah, in the meantime,